And if you think about how I mentioned, Malcolm was attentive to the mood of the youth, and he effectively predicted the rise of the Black Panther Party about 3 years before its existence. We're reading some of the literature from the Black Panther Party. And if you pick up the tone, it's a little bit more impatient with the state than even Malcolm was, right? The calls for violence are a little bit more explicit, and I wouldn't even call it violence. I would call it what it is, self-defense, right? That's why the speech is titled "In Defense of Self-Defense," right? But they're a lot more explicit about their positionality as it pertains to this notion of self-defense. One, as it pertains to the speech, he lays out his argument in the opening paragraph, right? He lets you know what he's dealing with and where he's coming from in the opening of the speech. Also, it's an ethical critique of American society, right? So it's critiquing American ethics. It's critiquing the ethics of American law, right? Who should obey the laws and who should these laws serve is some of the questions that Huey is raising in the opening paragraph. He uses the Declaration of Independence to serve as a critique of America, right? So you have this declaration that you say you abide by, but only certain segments of your population are able to reap the benefits of this so-called declaration. That is something that you see throughout the Black radical tradition. That's something that you see throughout a lot of Black activists who advocate for human rights. This starts off, Frederick Douglass. We didn't read any of his work, but he's really prevalent for using the American laws, the American Constitution, the American declarations against America in the way that they treat Black people, right? He talks about how the power structure inflicts pain and brutality, but then it provides an outlet for that pain and an outlet for that brutality. I'm curious to know, what do you guys think that outlet is, right? Another thing a claim that he makes, and I find it of great interest. We actually spent a good majority of the class on Tuesday dealing with this claim, right? He says that it's Black people only who are going to be able to tear down the system, right? Because Black people are situated in a position that they're intimately tied to the system, which will allow them to bring the system down. So one, do you agree with that claim, right? Do you find holes in that claim or in that argument, right? And then what does it mean for other non-Black people who are oppressed by the same forces, right? This notion of how Black people engage the struggle for their liberation becomes prevalent as well, also echoing some of the sentiments of the Ballot or the Bullet, right? And Huey states that if Black people go about their liberation struggle in the ways that the system dictates, then they'll in effect become groveling flunkies is the term that he uses. Very similar to Malcolm X's critique of the March on Washington, right? They tell you what street to march down, what time to start the march, what time the march must end, right? So if your enemy is setting the terms for your protest, how effective will your protest become? And then he makes another claim that the power of the oppressor works through the submission of the oppressed, right? Again, the power of the oppressor works through the submission of the oppressed. Very interesting claim. Again, we see little remnants of the Ballot of the Bullet surface, right? He says there's more Black people in America than countries there's more Black people in America than countries who are experiencing the full rights of the United Nations, right? So again, this idea that from a standpoint of populace, right, there's more Black people in the country of America from a populist standpoint than a lot of countries who are getting full rights from the UN. And if we think about the project of Malcolm X towards the end of his life, he wanted to take the plight of Black America before the United Nations for human rights struggles, right? And this is what Huey's saying from a numbers standpoint. We have enough numbers, we have enough of a population to where we should be receiving the rights and the support from the UN. And then he also says that Black people must move from the grassroots up to the Black bourgeoisie, right? So he's saying that there should not be a fragmentation between the Black proletariat or the Black working class and then the Black bourgeoisie, right? Both of them should be utilized to effectively enact this Black liberation movement. And then he invokes this idea and this notion of guerrilla warfare. So I do want to, before we end conversation, I want to make sure you guys understand what guerrilla warfare is. And then he invokes the words of Mao Zedong, no, I'm sorry, Bien Dien Phu, excuse me, from Vietnam. And he says, in order to get rid of the gun, you must pick up the gun, right? So in order to create a society or a world where there is no war, you must in effect go to war to eliminate the possibilities of war. So that's how he closes out his speech. Okay, so that's Huey, and that's in defense of self-defense. We also have Kwame Ture in his speech, From Black Power to Pan-Africanism. Not to spend too much time, but I do want to give you guys a historical context of who Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, is, right? This whole term, Black Power, is something that he coined. Stokely Carmichael is an individual, Kwame Ture, who has dedicated his life to revolutionary activism, right? He's from Trinidad. He's born in Trinidad. He moves to New York when he's about 5 years old, attends Bronx Science High School in New York. And from Bronx Science High School, he attends Howard University in Washington, D.C. Now, if you think back to last week and the week prior, I articulated the distinction between Northern activism and Southern activism, right? And the way that Malcolm X would address his audience juxtaposed to the way that Martin Luther King addressed his audience. So keep in mind, Kwame is someone who's born in New York, goes to school in DC, but I believe his sophomore year of college at Howard, organizing with at first NAG and then SNCC, the Student Nonviolent, the SNCC, Student Nonviolent or Coordinating Committee, I believe it's called SNCC. They go back down south to do organizing for voter registration, particularly in Jackson, Mississippi, and Loudon County, Mississippi. And these areas are 99% Black, but there's no Black elected officials. So the project that they picked up was to register all of these individuals to vote and place Black people in legislative offices and positions of power, right? In order to do so, you have to create a political party. So in effect, what Kwame did was created the Black Panther Party. He used the Panther because the way that the Panther operates, they won't strike or they won't become violent until they're backed into the corner. And in Kwame's estimation, Black people are backed into a corner and it's now time to strike, right? So he's the one who came up with this idea, the Black Panthers. During their attempts to register people to vote, it got extremely violent. There was a lot of people who were killed. There were a lot of people who were harmed. So now, mind you, this is in the South. This is under Martin Luther King. This is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? But as the violence picks up, Kwame's attentive to this, and he's starting to change his position on nonviolence. So what he would do, in effect, is hire individuals like the Deacons of Defense, and he would bring them in as armed security to make sure that the activism that they tried to do was able to be done, right? There's also, if you read his autobiography, there's examples of shootouts that take place between the Deacons of Defense and white militias that would try to prevent voter registration, right? But because of this story spreads and everyone wants to pick up the title, the Black Panthers, right? Huey P. Newton, from the speech that we previously read, and his co-founder, Bobby Seale, they were able to take over the title Black Panthers, and they were able to birth the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. So that's a brief history of Kwame Ture and how Kwame Ture's activism led to the development of the Black Panther Party. So does everybody understand? So let me ask it this way. Who does not understand what Pan-Africanism is? We are in the Pan-African Studies Department. This is a speech on Pan-Africanism. He lays out what Pan-Africanism is, but is there anybody who does not understand what Pan-Africanism is? So everybody has a good conception of what the term Pan-Africanism is. All right. Somebody gonna say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say no, I don't.
So Pan-Africanism, when you put the term pan before a nationality or ethnic group, it means inclusive to them all, right? So in this concept of Pan-Africanism, although I am born in the United States, I reside in the United States, I've never been to Africa, right? This framework would situate me as an African, at best as an African within the United States, right? So this idea of African American is kind of in conflict with the notion of Pan-Africanism, right? So at best, I would be an African in America. Africans who reside in Jamaica, right? They would call themselves Jamaicans, but from a standpoint of Pan-Africanisms, they are Africans who are in the Caribbean, right? So it's no matter where you reside, no matter where you're from, no matter where you're born, if you are a descendant of African people, you are in effect African, right? So it's about unifying all of the Africans throughout the diaspora, and then also eliminating colonialism, oppression, racism, white inferiority on the continent of Africa, right? And unifying the continent as a whole. So these are some of the tenets of Pan-Africanism. So one of the things that Kwame does, just like Huey, he really lays his argument out in the first paragraph, right? And he lays it out by explaining what Pan-Africanism is, right? And the importance of Pan-Africanism, but then he follows this up by saying the need to understand history, right? In a proper context. And if you think about this course, where did this course begin? What were some of the first readings that we had? What did some of the first readings cover? If we had to locate or position those readings, where did we start off?
Egypt, but it's not called that. It's called,
Kemet, right? So we started off in Africa prior to the contact with Europeans, right? So what Kwame is arguing, for the Africans in the Western Hemisphere, the United States, the Caribbean, because of the understanding of history that we were delivered, we start our experience in enslavement, right? For Africans on the continent, they start their experience, they start their history with colonization, right? So because of me reading this, I never begin any type of engagement with students from the standpoint of enslavement. I always start prior to what African people were doing, prior to the contact with Europeans, right? Because it places history in the proper context. Doing that, it allows it to make sense why I say that there were no slaves that were brought to the United States. There were African scientists, fathers, physicians, intellectuals who were enslaved and then brought to the United States, right? So it places history in its proper context. And this is what Kwame is arguing for within the first two paragraphs of his speech. He also says that Pan-Africanism is not a new concept, right? It develops at the onset of enslavement. So as soon as Africans begin to get kidnapped and brought to other parts of the world, that initiated this idea, this concept of Pan-Africanism. It becomes organized in the 1900s, in the 18th and 19th century, with the Pan-African Congress of 1901 that was organized by W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So he's kind of given us a genealogy of Pan-Africanism, starting with rebellions and slave revolts, and then organizing itself into actual organized conferences that take place in the 1900s. And then he makes this claim that is really profound, and through my studies of African history is absolutely true, right? He says, all great African intellectual giants are baptized in Pan-Africanism, right? So if you look at Malcolm X, starts out as Detroit Red, goes to prison, comes out, organizes with the Nation of Islam for 12 years, goes and develops his own organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity and Muslim Mosque Incorporated, right? But towards the end of his life, he returns back home from Africa and he's picking up the task of Pan-Africanism. His travels in Africa were dedicated to making sure African heads of state have an accurate understanding of what's going on for African people in the Americas, right? That's a Pan-African task. His idea of bringing the America to United Nations for human rights violations against African people, that's a Pan-African task, right? W.E.B. Du Bois, he starts off with the concept of the talented 10th, which essentially is I'm gonna take the most talented 10% of the Black population, make sure that they're educated, make sure that they are able to access as much as possible in social society, and then they'll be tasked to come back to educate the other 90%, right? This is his intellectual project when he gets started. When he dies, he's in Ghana, writing the Encyclopedia Africana for Kwame Nkrumah, who is the president of independent Ghana. And he is a staunch Pan-Africanist, right? As I mentioned earlier, he organized one of the first Pan-African conferences in 1901. So again, this notion of everyone of a great intellectual thought ends up as Pan-Africanist is absolutely correct. He also says, there's a lot of Pan-Africanists who claim that you don't have to return back to Africa in order to be considered a Pan-Africanist. He argues against that. He says, in fact, we do need to place Africa at the forefront, right? We need to place Africa at the center, because if Africa is not free, if Africa is not liberated, then none of us in effect will be free or liberated, right? So he wants to kind of problematize this notion that you do not have to deal with Africa to be a Pan-Africanist. And then he talks about the Africa being divided up into three groups. He has the progressive states, the neo-colonial states, and the European settler colonies, right? So the progressive states are, for example, Ghana, right, who was able to achieve its independence in 1965. Guinea, who is on its way to independence. Then you have neo-colonial states. Who is not familiar with the term neo-colonialism or does not understand what neo-colonialism is? Okay.
I don't.
So this idea of neo-colonialism, I'll explain it to you like this. In the context of Africa, it will be a Black face on a white institution. So I mentioned Ghana, right? The first country in Africa to gain its independence. Ghana was a British colony. So Britain came in, took over Ghana, took Ghana's resources. Kwame Nkrumah was able to overthrow British colonialism, but a coup d'etat takes place. So there's a military overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, and they place a leader in place who's Ghanaian, he's African, right? But he's putting the resources and the power back in the hands of the British, okay? So that's the way that neo-colonialism operates. And we are to take that to the American context, right? So Joe Biden is the 46th president. So the other 45, actually the other 44 have all been white men, right? So our 44th president was a Black man, right? Barack Obama. Under his rule, did the power change hands as far as who's running the country? No, right? Did Black people afford any more liberties under President Obama than with other 46 presidents? No, right? So again, you have a Black face on an institution that is still anti-Black, right? So in effect, you can look at Barack Obama as a neo-colonial leader within this country, right? So the face of the oppression looks like you, but the oppression in the system still operates the same way. So a black mask on white institutions. That's the way to think about neo-colonialism. European settler colonialism, that would be defined, if you think about apartheid South Africa, it's the same thing, right? You come in, you're gonna take over a territory, claim it yours, and not leave that territory. That's settler colonialism. America is a settler colonialism, right? That the Europeans came in, the indigenous people were here first, they got rid of them or moved them out and set up shop on their land. This is a settler colony. This is a settler colony, right? So he breaks down these three states of the African continent, but then he says what needs to happen is all African people throughout the world must and should support the progressive states because they're already on track or already on the path of obtaining their liberation, right? So he says we should all put our emphasis behind that. Another thing that I found of interest was the way that each speech was closed out. So I'm going to read both of them, and we'll do kind of like a comparative analysis of the way that each author closed out the speech. So we'll start with Kwame. The African for the last 500 years has known neither peace nor justice. His wealth, his labor have built Western Europe and America, excuse me. When these forces are harnessed for our benefit, the reconstruction of Mother Africa will be worthy of her glorious past. The setback in Ghana is no cause for dismay. Now, when he says the setback in Ghana, he's just talking about, as I mentioned, Kwame Nkrumah being able to liberate Ghana, and then the coup d'etat that overthrows Kwame Nkrumah. Okay, so that's just the setback that he mentions. Pan-Africanists know the setbacks are not new to the African struggle. This one has not even been long. We are not afraid of the inevitable bloodshed, for beyond it, we see victory in the air. So again, we are not afraid of the inevitable bloodshed, for beyond it, victory will be in the air. So that's how Kwame ends his speech. And then we have Huey P. Newton from the In Defense of Self-Defense. The blood, sweat, tears, and suffering of Black people are the foundations of the wealth and power of the United States of America. We are forced to build America, and if forced to, we will tear it down. The immediate result of this destruction will be suffering and bloodshed, but the end result will be perpetual peace for all mankind, right? So I hear a lot of similarities in the way that they ended both each speech. And if you think back to the Ballad of the Bullet, you see the same type of end of that speech as well, right? So those are the things that I found of interest. I was gonna play the video, but I'm not gonna do that just for sake of time. I'd rather hear your guys' thoughts. For those who did not see the video, it's 12 minutes, go back and watch it just so you could hear how just the flavor and the style that kind of comes off when they give these speech in person. It's vastly different reading it than hearing it perform, because it's definitely a performance that takes place when they deliver these speeches. So is there anybody who has not fishbowled? We're coming to the end of the semester, excuse me. And you want to make sure you get those participation points. So if you have not fishbowled, now would be the time to speak up. If not, we'll just open it up to a broader conversation about what people thought about the readings. So everybody's fishbowled, I'm assuming. All right. So we'll open up to class conversation. We can start with anything that you guys found of interest, any arguments that you disagreed with, any arguments that you supported, anything that you guys need to have clarified. We'll just open up the conversation. I'm waiting on y'all.
I'll go.
Thank you.
So I took 3 things from, like I connected both of the readings and the video. So on the reading for Black Power to Pan-Africanism, there's a line that says, where's it at? Africans today, irrespect or geographical location, have a common enemy and face common problems. And I kind of saw that being reflected on the other reading,
Mhm.
where it says that the laws and rules which officials inflict upon the poor people prevent them from functioning harmoniously. So it's like the the common problem with Africans is like the government and the law being put against them. And they cover this in the video because it says laws are put out not to protect us, but to protect them, which is the government. So it's like everything put out there is like in other words, to be used to push us down and make us feel like less of what we are. And the answer that I see for that they all like cover is to push back with violence.
And yeah, that's a very good point. I'm going to read the opening paragraph to Huey P. Newton's speech, because exactly what Valerie is talking about, you find that in the opening paragraph for Huey P. Newton, right? Men were not created in order to obey laws. Laws are created to obey men. They are established by men and should serve men. The laws and rules which officials inflict upon poor people prevent them from functioning harmoniously in society. There is no disagreement about the function of law in any circle. The disagreement arises from the question of which men laws are to serve, right? I'm gonna read that one more time. The disagreement arises from the question of which men laws are to serve, right? Such lawmakers ignore the fact that it is the duty of the poor and unrepresented to construct rules and laws that serve their interests better. Rewriting unjust laws is a basic human rights and a fundamental obligation, right? So this is what Valerie is talking about, right? So the way, what Huey is arguing, the way that these laws have been constructed is been a way to marginalize, oppress, and further inflict violence upon the poor, right? And upon Black people, right? Very good point. And there's a thread that's been tied between both readings about how to deal with this type of, with these laws, with this oppression, right? Valeria used the term violence. I don't know if I would call it violence, right? Because for me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, right? I don't have the ultimate authority on this. It's an opinion, and opinions can be wrong, right? Um, if you have a bully who's been with you from kindergarten to 12th grade, right? And he's been whooping your ass from kindergarten to 12th grade, right? And then your 12th grade year, you get your weight up and you whip his ass back. Helena says it's self-defense, right? And I would agree. And I think that's why he called the speech Huey P. Newton in defense of self-defense, right? So it's a vastly different reality between violence and self-defense. That bully that was whipping your ass from kindergarten to 12th grade, he is inflicting violence on you, right? The fact that we have been taught through schooling that Columbus came and brought opportunities, freedom, independence, and civilization to the indigenous people is an act of violence that's been put on you ideologically, right? The fact that we have a holiday to institute this violence that Columbus inflicted on the native people, and we celebrate that violence, that's an ideological violence that's been inflicted upon us, right? So where the distinction lies is who is inflicting the violence, right? And they've been able to manipulate our understanding of violence to where we think when someone is acting in self-defense, they're actually acting violently, right? And I think this summer gave us a very good depiction of this. All the protests that took place were deemed violent, deemed unruly, right? But they rarely dealt with the actual police violence that instituted those protests, right? But when these violent protesters are responding violently, quote unquote, no one talks about the police violence that was used to quell the protest, right? that's looked at as a authenticated force, right? So when the state or when the government does it, it's force. When the masses and when the people do it, it's violence, right? But in actually, it's really self-defense. Anybody else? What are some thoughts about the readings or the video, if you've seen the video?
What I found interesting was how Huey P. Newton brought up the fact that at one point America was a British colony and they felt oppressed by their rules. So what did they do? They decided they saw them as a threat and, did what it took so that they could become independent. But it's like now that Black people feel oppressed and they want to do the same thing, they don't get to.
Right.
Which is completely ironic.
Yeah. And that's something that's prevalent throughout the Black radical tradition, right? It's just calling out the hypocrisy in the way that this nation operates, right? Even Malcolm says, the forefathers of America said, give me liberty or give me death, right? That's a violent statement. I'm gonna either get my liberty or I'm gonna fight you till I die, right? But that becomes the nation's credo. But when it comes to marginalized groups here, that's not permissible. It's a very good point. Anybody else?
And I think it's on page 136.
For which
He explains how the slaves have always outnumbered. For Huey.
Yeah, okay. I'm with you, go ahead.
He explains how the slaves have always outnumbered the slave master, but the oppressor the power of the oppressor rests upon the submission of the people. I think he's trying to explain how numbers don't really matter. It's mainly the actions that happen, because I'm not sure what page it was, but he explains how the numbers don't, he also explains how the numbers don't matter and the power is in the hands of what your actions have.
Yeah, it's actually it's following the passage that you just read. And I'm gonna go back just a little bit more from what you read because it has another important part. So this is a really good point, Precious. The oppressor must be harassed until his doom. He must have no peace by day or night. The slaves have always outnumbered the slave masters. The power of the oppressor rests upon the submission of the people. When Black people really unite and rise up in all their splendid millions, they will have the strength to smash injustice. We do not underestimate the power in our numbers. We have millions and millions of Black people scattered across the continent and throughout the Western Hemisphere. There are more Black, and that's when he goes into the more Black people in America than other nations enjoying the full membership of the United Nations. So what I would like to do is kind of put this conversation on pause, put a pin on this, because this leads into something that I'm very curious. Because he makes the claim, let me see. I'm gonna read it. Everything dictates. Anyway, it's the claim that only Black people would be able to bring down the oppressive state of America, right? Okay, here we go. No, it's not. Yeah. So again, this notion that it's the Black people's responsibility, it's only Black people who will be able to bring down the government empire based on their intimacy with this government empire. I'm curious to know your guys' thoughts about that. Here, I'm gonna read it, I found it. So, it is our belief that the Black people in America are the only people who can free the world, loosen the yoke of colonialism, and destroy the war machine. Black people who are within the machine can cause it to malfunction. They can, because of their intimacy with the mechanism, destroy the engine that is enslaving the world. America will not be able to fight every Black country in the world and fight a civil war at the same time. It is militarily impossible to do both of these things at once. So I'm curious to know your guys' thoughts as it pertains to that. Do you agree, right? For the Black people in the class, do you feel that that's a responsibility that you should take up, right? Is it a fair assessment of your role in the world? For the non-Black people in the class, where do you see yourself within this passage, right? Within this claim or within this argument? Do you think it lets you off the hook? Do you think it's an accurate assessment? I'm just curious to know your guys' thoughts. Yeah, I'll repeat it. So it reads, it is our belief, and it's on page 135, towards the top of the page. But it says, it is our belief that the Black people in America are the only people who can free the world, loosen the yoke of colonialism, and destroy the war machine. Black people who are within the machine can cause it to malfunction. They can, because of their intimacy with the mechanism, destroy the engine that is enslaving the world. America will not be able to fight every Black country in the world and fight a civil war at the same time. It is militarily impossible to do both of these things at once. That makes sense, Miracle?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
I think for me as a Black person, I think if I understood the passage well enough more towards the end, I think I kind of agree. I don't think, well, no, I don't think it's a Black person's duty to be the only person to stop colonialism and to stop all of these things. I think by saying that, it's kind of everyone leaving it to us rather than having white people stand up for it, because in my personal opinion, I think when we have other white people who are with us for the cause, that will create change. Because if these white people haven't been listening to us for how many centuries, are they really gonna still continue to listen to us unless there's white people with us in our agenda, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
If I understood the passage correctly.
So let's do this then, Miracle. Let's reverse engineer it. What do you understand the passage to mean? And you can work it that way.
I think towards the end, he was probably explaining how, okay, I got confused because it was talking about, I think there was a lot of metaphors and that's what was confusing me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think it talked about, yeah, there was just a lot of metaphors that was confusing me, but I think he was overall talking about for Black people to stop colonialism. That's mainly what I got, or to stop oppression. But yeah, that's all I got, really.
Let's do this. Let's unpack the passage, right? So it is our belief, and we said ours, the Black Panther Party's belief, that Black people in America are the only people who can free the world, right? So he's talking about not just freeing or liberating Black people. Black people can free the entire world, right? And loosen the yoke of colonialism, right? So the grip that colonialism has on the world, Black people would be able to kind of loosen that grip, right? And destroy the war machine, right? So the war machine is just this empire that is predicated on war, right? So how long has America been at war with the Middle East? At least since 2001, 2000,
Yeah.
right? So that's when he talks about a war machine, this is what he means. Black people who are within the machine, right? Because we live on the grounds of America. We're here, we're within this machine, can cause it to malfunction. They can, because of their intimacy within the mechanism. So that mechanism is the machine. So not just a question I'm posing to Miracle, but to the whole class, right? When you talk about intimacy, what does that invoke for you, right? Who are individuals that you become intimate with? Not a hard question. Who are you intimate with? Y'all all adults, y'all grown. I'm sure you have some intimacies. Who are you intimate with? So nobody on here is intimate. Y'all in front of me today. It's not complex, right? You guys understand the notion. You may not have a definition of what intimacy is, but you've heard the term before, I'm sure, right? When you hear that term, partners, thank you, Samantha. So you're intimate with your partners, right? Boyfriend, girlfriend, partners. So what does intimacy mean in the context of what Huey P. Newton's talking about, right? So let's go back in time, and we're gonna go into the enslaved institution, right? We're gonna go into the plantation. So it's not hyperbole, this is literal, actual fact, right? So when the enslaver, the slave owner, the white master, right? When he would have children, the mother would not raise the children. The mother would not nurture the children. The mother would not bring up the children, right? Oftentimes, if there was a woman who was enslaved, who was also lactating or also has children around the age of the slave owner's child, right? It would be the task of that enslaved African to literally breastfeed the slaver's child, right? And if you go on the internet, you'll see pictures of enslaved African women breastfeeding white children, right? So that's an intimate interaction, right? Oftentimes, the enslavers would go out to the slave quarters and have intimate relations. They would have sex with the enslaved Africans, right? Which would produce offspring. Thomas Jefferson, right? All the offsprings that he produced with his enslaved African women, right? Same thing. So in effect, if an enslaved African woman has her children through her own, with her husband, right, with her partner, and also births children through rape of her enslaver, those two, the product of rape and the product of her husband, are what? Siblings, right? Another intimate relationship, okay? Oftentimes, the wife was not preparing the meals in the slave institution, right? The slaves, the enslaved, would be the ones to prepare the meals and cook the food, okay? So this is that intimacy that Huey is talking about. Now let's take that notion of intimacy and apply it to his premise, right? Because he says, where did it go? There we go. Okay, he says, they can, right? Well, let me go back one more. Black people who are within the machine can cause it to malfunction, right? So this is where he ends. The following sentence says, they can, meaning cause it to malfunction, because of their intimacy with the mechanism, destroy the engine that is enslaving the world, right? So think about how that will play out. So if you're abusing me and I'm cooking your food, I'm making your drink, right? How easy would it be to put something in your drink, to put something in your food, and take you out, right? Intimately tied, right? If I'm raising your children, right? And you're allowing me to be the overseer of your children, and you're allowing me to make sure that your children is safe, how easy would it be to take them out to go play, take little Johnny out in the river? I don't know, boss, little Johnny drown, right? It's easy. There's no war that took place. There's no real bloodshed, no real violence, right? These are ways that we could undermine this system of enslavement because of our intimate ties to this system, right? So this is what Huey's talking about when he says the intimate ties that we have to the war machine will allow us to bring that war machine down, right? So this is his claim as to why Black people are more positioned to be able to overthrow this system of colonialism that's oppressing the world, right? So that's the claim. Now, we don't necessarily have to agree with the claim. Miracle says from what she understands of the claim, she's inclined to somewhat feel that we need white allies possibly to authenticate this world liberation. I agree it would make the process easier, but I don't know how really on board they would be for that fight. But I'm curious to hear other thoughts, other opinions, especially for those who are not Black, right? So what is your stake in this claim? Because one thing's for sure, you guys are not absolved from systems of oppression, right?
I kind of agree with Miracle that we should include white people in it because they have, in other words, you could say they have more power and will be able to give us that power. We'll give Black people that power. And then I kind of, at first, before you had like explained it, the way I interpreted, like based off the readings before and other lectures, we're technically all descendants from Africa because Africans were the first people. So kind of taking it that way, I feel like if Black people or the African people are the ones with power to change all of that, that's technically meaning like all of us are like people of color because we have all experienced similar stuff. And then after your explanation, the way I kind of took it was like, in other words, he's kind of like with intimacy and all that. I kind of took it's like we have the power to fight back. I wrote it down. It's like we have the power to fight back in a way that they won't be able to deal with or that they won't be able to like be prepared for, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I took in.
You hit the nail on the head, Valeria. That's exactly what he's saying. So, like, this, for example, right? Who are the majority of farm workers in this country right now? What nationality do they make up?
They're mostly Latinos or Hispanics.
So let's just say hypothetically, all of them said, fuck it, we ain't doing this no more, right? Y'all ain't getting no produce from us, period, until you let all them children up out them cages. 666 children, right? What do you think is gonna happen to them children in the cages if we cannot get food? They're gonna let them motherfuckers go, right? So this is what Huey is trying to get us to think about and reposition themselves. So in LA, very few Black unions are left, but one of those Black unions are the public transportation system, right? That's one Black union that still remains intact. What if they all said, we're not doing no more bus driving, we're not doing no more Metrolink driving, we're not doing no more public transportation until you address the issue of police brutality. The system has been brought to a stalemate and they'll be put in a position to have to address these grievances, right? So this is what Huey's saying. He's talking about this untapped power base that we don't tap into because we're fragmented and we don't recognize or view our power, right? You guys are, well, at least Valeria and Miracle are taking the conversation to where I didn't really take it, in the sense of involving white people, right? Because this is one thing I know about power through a study of it, is not given away ever. That's not how power concedes, right? And the only thing that power responds to is more power, right? So if we're talking about white folks giving away or giving up their power, is never gonna happen. We've been hoping and praying and organizing and marching for that for over 500 years. Hasn't happened yet. So that's not going to happen, right? Not to say that there has been a change in the way a lot of white people view this institution of power. Yeah, there has been some changes. And I think if you look at what's going on in the summer, you see a lot more involvement with non-Black people in BLM protests, BLM movements and things of that nature. A lot white people doing it as well, right? So there is a change that's taking place. But overall, on the mass large, right, there's still over 50% of them who voted for Trump. So that shows you right there where their allegiance is, given all that they know about this person, right? So power is not going to concede without another form of power. So that's one thing that we have to understand. So within that is this notion of, especially as it pertains to white people involving themselves in the liberation struggle. For them to involve in that is in effect them organizing against their own power, right? So to dismantle a system that has white folks at the top, for a white person to organize into that movement to dismantle that system is in effect to organize against their own power, right? I don't know how many people are willing to do that. And to be fair, right, that is just not a white phenomenon. If you look at Africa now, there's people and there's leaders who've been in power as long as I've been alive, right? They're not white, but they just don't want to relinquish their power, right? So there's something that comes on with this phenomenon of power where you want to maintain it. And we can't, as theorists, assume that anyone's going to simply relinquish that power. That's why this notion of bloodshed is so prevalent in these conversations, because they're recognizing that it's not going to be given away without bloodshed. Let's get some other people's thoughts and opinions about what we're talking about now, as far as the role of Black folks to overthrow system of oppression, or anything that was discussed in the reading or in a conversation. You could volunteer or you could be voluntold. It's up to you. So Melissa, what were your thoughts on either the role of Black people or other marginalized groups of overthrowing oppression, or anything that was discussed or anything that you read? What are your thoughts, Melissa?
I'm gonna look for the page that I saw based on both
Let us know what
readings.
reading and the page also, please.
So I think a good connection that I was thinking about was on towards Malcolm X based on Huey, because they're talking about how it takes a person to stand up and show others. And I was thinking that based on from Black Power to Pan-Africanism, it's also talking about how let me look for the page.
Do you know what the theme was? Like kind of what he was talking about? I can maybe help you with the page.
I believe it was page 255, where it says based on how launching programs or having leaders to a country, like President, I don't know if I'm saying it correctly, but Nurama and President Toure, I think both passages are giving people clear thoughts on how certain people could help bring awareness. And I think to today, like you were saying earlier with Barack Obama, although he was a symbol of how we think that would fix things and it's not, I think more it should be about how it should be a bigger group towards like a Congress or towards presidency. It shouldn't just be based on one person. And I think the book is giving a lot of connection to both of them, how certain leaders bring certain things together to make something happen. Because even if it was just one person, because we're all told like Martin Luther King, but it was not just one person, it's more than one person. And people saying it's just Barack Obama, it's not just Barack Obama, it's more than that. You know, it's more than just one person. And I think that's what stood out to me between both passages.
You know, Melissa, that's very interesting because you invoked Kwame Nkrumah. And one of the things about Kwame Nkrumah was, as I mentioned, you know, the first leader of independent or liberated Ghana, right? Which was the first country in Africa to get its independence. But on his inauguration speech, on the Independence Day speech for Ghana, So Ghana's flag is green, yellow, and red with a black star in the middle, right? And he says, you know, I'm gonna raise this flag for Ghana, and it has the black star in it because it's the first nation in Africa to earn its independence. But Africa will not be free, or Ghana will not be free until the entirety of Africa is free, right? So I believe Africa has 53 countries. Kwame Nkrumah's goal was to establish those countries as states and have a United States of Africa, so to speak, right? So when you talk about this notion of a collective leadership, that is something that Kwame Nkrumah was about, right? He wanted Africa to be a nation, a complete nation as a whole, and be strong enough to where if African peoples abroad in the Americas, in the Caribbean are experiencing some type of oppression, they can look to the nation of Africa for support, right? Just as if somebody, well, let's be particular, just as a white American were to travel abroad and get into some trouble, the United States would come to support them, right? Kwame Nkrumah envisioned Africa being the same thing for African people. So what you're picking up on, Melissa, is very astute. This idea or this notion of a collective leadership opposed to an individual leadership. And to put it on a broader, larger context, right? When you talk about notions of modernity, you talk about notions of Western society, right? It has been positioned as a individualistic society, right? So think about it. Even when you go to college and you get your degree, it's to get your degree, to get your job, to give yourself a better situation, possibly your family, right? It's never about, let me get a degree that will improve all Black people or all Indigenous people, right? It's just about you and at most your broader family, right? So this is a notion of modernity, the individual, right? Opposed to the collective. If you are to go back to ancient African interpretations of social structures, right? They're communal. So the idea is about the whole, not just the one, right? So I'm not successful until everybody that's in my circle is successful, right? So this is some of the juxtapositions between our now and the past that was disrupted by European invasion. So it's a very good point. Who else? Oh shit, we out of time, my fault. Okay, let's do this. For those who came in late, we are not meeting next Thursday because of Thanksgiving. We'll all come together on Tuesday. So we'll have a complete class on Tuesday. We're covering some poetry. Is there anybody who